There are moments in history that nobody sees coming, not the diplomats, not the generals, not the ancient war-hardened councils who have watched 1,000 civilizations rise from mud and fire and slowly learn to reach for the stars. Nobody saw this one coming, and that more than anything else was exactly the point. The chamber had no name in any human language. It hung suspended in the darkness between three dying stars, a structure so vast and so old that the civilizations who first built it had long since crumbled into silence. Its walls were crystalline, engineered from materials that absorbed starlight and released it slowly like a living thing breathing. In the amber glow of three distant suns, the chamber pulsed with something that felt almost like consciousness. Almost. The species who gathered here called it the seat of authority. The species who feared it called it many things, most of them unprintable. The species who had never heard of it, the young ones, the rim dwellers, the primitive starfarers still fumbling with their first warp equations, they didn't call it anything at all. They didn't know it existed until it decided they needed to. High Arbiter Velshara moved through the anteroom with the measured precision of someone who had spent 400 cycles learning that authority was not performed. It was inhabited. She wore no ceremonial robes today, no ceremonial anything. Just the clean, dark uniform of the Council's executive branch and the weight of approximately 4,000 years of unbroken institutional memory pressing down on every step she took. 6 eyes. Most species found that unsettling at first. By the second meeting, they had usually stopped noticing. By the third, they understood that having 6 eyes meant she never stopped watching anything. Every corner of a room. Every subtle shift in a delegate's posture. Every flicker of calculation moving across a face that the delegate thought they were keeping still. She missed nothing. She had built a career on missing nothing. The chamber was filling now. 47 species represented by their finest minds, their sharpest tongues, their most strategically composed faces. The Zenthar delegation arrived in their characteristic formation. Counselor Drath at the front, scale crest already raised in the posture that meant he had already decided something before the session began. The Mulvaran came quietly, Counselor Mariseth trailing her fingers along the crystalline wall as if reading it like text. The Krathic Dominion sent 3 representatives as they always did because a single representative might be tempted to compromise, and the Krathic considered compromise a biological defect. 47 species, hundreds of delegates, thousands of years of collective history filling the room like a physical presence, heavy and absolute. Velshara took her position at the central podium and let the silence settle. This was another skill she had spent centuries developing. Most beings rushed to fill silence. They mistook it for emptiness. They didn't understand that silence properly deployed was the loudest thing in any room. She let it ring, then she spoke. The human vessel has crossed the outer demarcation line. She didn't raise her voice. She never raised her voice. The neural translators, embedded in every delegate's consciousness, did the work of transmission. Her words arrived not as sound, but as direct meaning, bypassing language, entirely landing in the cognitive centers of 47 different alien minds simultaneously. Sector 447 Theta, they were warned 3 times, they did not retreat. The ripple that moved through the assembly was not fear. The council did not traffic in fear. Fear implied vulnerability, and vulnerability implied weakness. And weakness was a concept that the Galactic Council had spent 4,000 years carefully and completely eradicating from its public presentation. What moved through the assembly was something more precise than fear. It was professional concern. Counselor Drath leaned forward. His crest flared not red, which would have meant anger, but a deep amber that meant he was already calculating responses. The humans, he said, and the translator flattened the contempt in his voice only slightly. The isolated ones. The rim-worlders. Correct. Velshara pulled up the holographic display. It materialized above the central podium, a 3-dimensional rendering of Sector 447 Theta, with fleet positions marked in cool blue, and the single intruding vessel marked in white. White, the color the Council's system used for objects too small to assign a threat rating. The human ship was very white. Survey vessel classification, Velshara continued, 47 meters, single hull configuration, no visible weapon systems. They claimed to be conducting research. Research. The word landed in the chamber with a particular quality. Not quite silence. More like the moment before silence when every being in a room simultaneously decides how to react to something absurd. Drath's crest flared brighter. They test us, as primitive species do when they first discover the boundary between their small world and actual power. Velshara's primary eyes narrowed fractionally. She had reviewed the human file that morning. It was not a long file. The humans had been cataloged 70 cycles ago, a species barely beyond their own star system, technologically unremarkable, occupying a small cluster of worlds on the galactic rim. They had submitted the required observation documentation with careful, almost excessive politeness. They had followed every procedural step correctly, completely, and without complaint. And now one of their ships was sitting in restricted space and not moving. The question before us, Velshara said, is whether to activate Consequence Protocol 7. The silence that followed had a different texture. Older, heavier. Consequence Protocol 7 had been deployed 42 times in Council history. 42 times the targeted species had withdrawn. Some immediately, some after the first stage. A handful had required the second or third stage before the message penetrated. But all 42 had eventually yielded, every single one. Because the protocol was not designed to punish, it was designed to educate. Systematic escalation of consequences. Each stage more severe than the last, each one calibrated to demonstrate with perfect clarity that defiance of the Council was not a strategic option. Economic isolation, military demonstration, technological embargo, complete severing from the galactic community. The protocol was 4,000 years old. It had never failed. Perhaps, offered Counselor Mariseth, her voice carrying the characteristic musical quality of the Mulverin, they simply don't understand the gravity of their situation. The humans are young, they may not grasp what they've done. Coordinator Thiex's response was immediate. They were warned in 17 languages, including their own primary dialect. They acknowledged each warning individually. A pause. And then they proceeded anyway. And Drath's crest settled into the flat, decisive posture that meant he had already made up his mind 3 exchanges ago and was waiting for everyone else to catch up. Then they are either fools or arrogant. In either case, the solution doesn't change. Murmurs of agreement moved through the chamber like a tide. Velshara accessed the protocol interface. Her neural implants connected to the Council's vast bureaucratic network, a system so deeply integrated into galactic infrastructure that activating a protocol was less like issuing a command and more like adjusting a fundamental fact about the universe. Very well. I am initiating Consequence Protocol 7. Stage 1, Economic Warning. The display shifted. Trade routes appeared across the galactic map, thousands of them, the capillary system of commerce that kept 47 civilizations functioning. With a thought, Velshara began closing doors. One by one, trade routes to the human territories went dark. Not destroyed, simply closed. Every council species would receive the directive simultaneously. No commerce with humanity. No resources. No technology. No communication. Stage 1 active. The human vessel is being transmitted the full schedule of consequences for their continued presence. The council settled. This was familiar. This was routine. A young species would receive the message, calculate the cost of continued defiance, and make the only rational choice available to them. It had happened 42 times before. It would happen 43 times now. The chamber waited with the comfortable patience of an institution that had never been wrong. 15 minutes passed. The human vessel has acknowledged our transmission, reported Coordinator Thiexa, his compound eyes reflecting data streams. Trajectory unchanged. Velshara's expression held steady. They received the full warning, confirmed, and they've sent a response packet. Thiexa paused. His mandibles clicked once, a reflex he usually controlled better. It's approximately 400,000 data lines, mathematical notations, economic models, some form of analysis. The chamber absorbed this. In 4,000 cycles, no species had ever responded to Stage 1 of Consequence Protocol, 7 with anything except one of 3 things: immediate compliance, frantic appeals for mercy, or panicked silence. The humans had sent them a spreadsheet. Drath's crest went very still. Proceed to Stage 2, he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite the certainty it was meant to be. Military posturing. Deploy the 3rd Border Fleet to their position. Show them what they face. Across 3 star systems, Council warships powered their drives. 200 vessels, each one capable of reducing a continent to glass. They moved in the coordinated sweep of a military apparatus that had never lost a territorial engagement in recorded history, converging on Sector 447 Theta with the unhurried confidence of something that has never had reason to hurry. The display above the chamber updated in real time. 200 warships materializing around a single small human vessel. It looked from this angle like a stone being circled by storm clouds. It looked almost pitiful. And somewhere in the very back of Velshara's mind, beneath 4,000 cycles of certainty, beneath the institutional weight of an unbroken record, a small, quiet, entirely unwelcome thought formed itself into words. What if they weren't afraid Fleet Commander Zarvox had commanded border fleets for 30 cycles? He had faced pirate armadas operating across 7 systems. He had stared down rogue AI constructs whose threat projections filled entire tactical displays. He had navigated territorial disputes between militant species who communicated primarily through weapons fire. He had never seen anything quite like this. "Sensor sweep complete," his tactical officer reported. The young officer's voice carried the tone of someone reading a document that says something the document should not be capable of saying. "Human vessel measures 47 meters. Single hull configuration. Power output consistent with basic fusion drive." Zarvox waited. "No visible weapon systems, sir." "None. None." Zarvox stared at the display. 200 warships, perfect formation. The kind of overwhelming force that had, over 30 cycles of border command, caused every species he had ever deployed it against to immediately and completely reconsider whatever choices had brought them to this moment. And at the center of it all, a 47-meter research vessel. No weapons, no defensive screens worth mentioning. They entered restricted space in an unarmed survey ship. "Yes, sir." Zarvox's spines flattened against his skull. Species that violated council space came in warships. They came ready to fight or ready to flee. The form varied, the underlying logic never did. You entered someone else's territory carrying the means to defend yourself. That was not aggression. That was simple physics. The humans had come in a research vessel, an unarmed research vessel, with apparently 3 crew members and what his sensors were suggesting was a very sophisticated computer array taking up most of the available interior space. "Transmit stage 2 warning. Full fleet power signature. I want them to understand exactly what they're looking at." The transmission went out, a detailed catalog of fleet capabilities, projected casualty timelines, the precise sequence of events that would follow if the human vessel did not immediately alter its course. 200 warships, 4,000 crew, weapons capable of reducing their vessel to its component atoms in less time than it took a human heart to complete a beat. The response arrived 7 minutes later. Zarvox's communications officer opened it, read it, went very quiet, then turned around with the expression of someone who has just discovered that the map they've been using is completely wrong about the shape of the territory. "Sir, they've sent another data packet." "How large?" "Larger than the first by a factor of 10. "What kind of data?" "Tactical projections, sir. Fleet formation analysis. Probability matrices for engagement scenarios." He paused. "They've calculated our fuel consumption rates, optimal firing solutions for every weapon system we're carrying, estimated response time for council reinforcements." Silence on the bridge. "They analyzed our fleet in 7 minutes, Zarvox said slowly. "Yes, sir. Our formations are classified. Our capabilities are—" "They didn't guess, Commander." The officer looked up, his eyes holding the expression of someone standing at the edge of a very large drop. "They measured spectroscopic analysis of our drive emissions, gravitational displacement calculations, heat signature, profiling from every weapons array." He exhaled. "They've reverse-engineered our entire tactical doctrine from passive observation." Zarvox sat very still in his command chair. In 30 cycles of border command, he had expected many things from vessels surrounded by his fleet. He had expected terror. He had expected desperate last transmissions. He had expected the particular kind of defiance that species sometimes performed when they knew they were beaten and wanted to die with dignity. He had not expected homework. "What else is in the packet?" The officer checked. "A note, sir. Plain text." He read it, looked up, read it again. "It says we acknowledge the consequences. Calculations attached." The bridge was very quiet. Outside the viewport, 200 warships held their positions around a 47-meter research vessel that was doing nothing more threatening than existing. And somewhere in the human ship, someone had finished their analysis, attached it to a message, and sent it to the most powerful military commander in this sector of the galaxy. "We acknowledge the consequences. Calculations attached." Zarvox had spent 30 cycles learning to read situations. Every instinct he had developed over those 3 decades was now quietly and insistently telling him the same thing. He was the one who was not prepared for this meeting. Aboard the human vessel, it was 1847 hours ship time. Commander Sarah Chen sat in the compact bridge with her hands folded in her lap, her posture relaxed in the way that people who have prepared very thoroughly for very difficult things are sometimes relaxed. Not careless, not confident in the performative sense. Something quieter. The composure of someone who has run the numbers so many times that the numbers have become almost familiar. The bridge was small. The entire vessel was small. 47 meters of carefully allocated space every cubic centimeter serving a specific purpose. 3 analyst stations, 1 command position, a computer array that occupied more volume than the crew quarters. Displays showing real-time data from 17 different sensor systems, each one feeding into the central modeling system that was tracking 400,000 variables across the surrounding fleet and updating probability matrices every 12 seconds. Lieutenant Morrison monitored his console with the focused attention of someone who understood that the margin for error was currently very small. Stage 2 activated commander, military posturing deployed, fleet signature transmitted. He checked his secondary display. Response time 47 minutes. We estimated 45 to 50. Well, within parameters. Morrison looked at the display showing 200 alien warships surrounding their position. Then at his commander. Then at the display again. They're going to escalate, he said. Yes. Chen's voice carried the flatness of someone stating a fact that has already been thoroughly accounted for. Stage 3 next, economic isolation. Estimated deployment in 40 to 60 minutes. And we just wait. We transmit the impact assessment. Make sure it reaches every council member personally. Include the political analysis, all of it. Commander David Park looked up from his station. Stage 4 after that, military blockade, total territorial containment. He said it the way you say something you've rehearsed enough times that the words have stopped having weight. Estimated deployment. Based on fleet positioning and council bureaucratic response patterns, 6 to 8 hours. Park nodded slowly, looked at his console, looked at the viewport. Outside, 200 warships held position. Their weapon systems powered their targeting arrays, doing something uncomfortable to the hull readings. Then we have time for dinner, he said. We do. Chen stood stretching slightly. Lieutenant Morrison, what's on the menu? Morrison blinked. A portion of his brain dedicated to processing the current tactical situation encountered something his commander said and needed a moment to recalibrate. Synth protein curry, ma'am, or the vegetable pasta. I'll take the curry. Same, said Park without looking up. Set condition yellow. Alert me when the blockade fleet begins deployment. Until then, rest. It's going to be a long few days. She moved toward the small galley. It's going to be a long few days. She disappeared through the hatchway. Morrison stared after her. Outside the hull, 200 alien warships surrounded them. The most powerful governmental body in the known galaxy had just declared humanity economically invalid. A fleet commander had received a tactical analysis of his own capabilities and was, if their models were correct, currently experiencing significant professional discomfort. And Commander Chen was having curry for dinner. Morrison turned back to his console. Updated the transmission package. Added the political analysis section that detailed which council member species would face internal governmental pressure from specific resource shortages and in what sequence and with what projected political consequences. He sent it. Then he went to get the pasta. Fleet Commander Zarvox watched the human ship on his displays for 2 more hours. The calculations sat in his tactical system like a splinter. Every time he moved his attention elsewhere, they pulled him back. Because they were not wrong, he had run portions of them through his own tactical computer quietly without flagging it to his staff, and the results were uncomfortable. The humans had identified weaknesses in his formation that his own tactical doctrine didn't account for. Not because his doctrine was poor. It had been refined over centuries by the finest military minds across 47 species. But those minds had refined it by studying each other. The humans had studied it from outside. And sometimes the most important things about a system are only visible from outside the system. The council authorization for Stage 4 arrived as he was reviewing the data for the 4th time. Full blockade, 900 additional warships inbound. The 3rd Border Fleet reinforced by the 5th, 7th, and 9th Tactical Groups. 1,100 vessels total. A sphere so dense that a communications probe couldn't navigate it without triggering an interdiction field. Zarvox began issuing orders. But as he did, a feeling he couldn't immediately name had settled into the base of his skull and was refusing to move. He knew the difference between an opponent who was trapped and an opponent who was waiting. An opponent who was trapped looked at the exits. An opponent who was waiting looked at you. The human ship was looking at him. The final transmission arrived before his deployment was complete. Short, Plain text. 3 words with a translation appended by the automatic system. He read it again. See you tomorrow. Not a plea, not a threat, not a final defiant declaration from a cornered species. An appointment. His tactical officer was waiting for him to say something. 30 cycles of command had given Zarvox very good control over his expressions, and he used all of it now to keep his face carefully neutral as he finished issuing the blockade deployment orders. But somewhere behind that carefully neutral face, something was happening that Zarvox had not experienced in a very long time. He was no longer certain he understood the situation he was in. By the time Stage 4 deployed at dawn, Galactic Standard Time Sector 447 Theta contained 1,100 Council warships arranged in the most comprehensive military formation the Council had assembled in 600 cycles. The sphere was perfect. Sensor nets at every angle. Interdiction fields layered in overlapping coverage. Nothing could leave the containment zone without being tracked, identified, and stopped. And at the absolute center of this vast, overwhelming display of galactic authority, one 47-meter human research vessel sat in silence. Its lights dimmed, its power consumption reduced to the minimum required to keep 3 people alive and comfortable. They were the sensors confirmed sleeping. Velshara watched this on the chamber display and felt the first genuine doubt of her 40-year career. She had spent the night reviewing the human data packets, not sleeping, reviewing, running the calculations through her own analytical implants, cross-referencing, checking assumptions, looking for the error that would explain why these numbers could not possibly be as accurate as they appeared. She hadn't found one. The economic models were flawless. Every supply chain dependency, every resource relationship, every political pressure point, all of it mapped with a precision that shouldn't have been possible from a species that had been in contact with the galactic community for less than 5 cycles. Unless they had been watching for much longer than 5 cycles. Unless first contact had meant something different to them than it meant to the Council. She pulled up the economic impact model again. Section 12, the one detailing what would happen to the Zenthar energy infrastructure within 2 cycles of humanity's removal from the supply network. They knew she thought. They knew we would isolate them, and they positioned themselves to make it expensive. Outside the crystalline walls of the chamber, 1,000 warships held the most comprehensive containment formation in 6 centuries around a research vessel where 3 human beings were apparently getting a full 8 hours of sleep before whatever came next. Velshara looked at the display for a long time. Then she did something she had not done in 40 years of holding the highest office in galactic governance. She doubted herself, just slightly, just enough to feel it. Just enough to understand that doubt, like silence, was sometimes the most honest thing available to her. The human ship powered up at 0800 hours. The transmission request arrived 12 seconds later. Full holographic conference, reported Coordinator Theixa. Direct link to the Council chamber. They're requesting to address the full assembly. Velshara looked at the display, at the single white marker at the center of 1,100 blue ones. Granted, her voice was perfectly steady. The crystalline walls of the chamber dimmed, and humanity walked in. She materialized at the center of the chamber like a fact, not like a threat, not like a supplicant, not like anything the assembled delegates of the Galactic Council had ever received in this chamber in 4,000 cycles of continuous operation. Just a fact, standing upright, hands at her sides, 2 eyes scanning the room with the complete attention of someone who has prepared for this moment for 3 years and is now simply present inside it. Commander Sarah Chen of the United Earth Space Command was not a large person by any physical standard. No ceremonial markings, no visible weaponry, no entourage of secondary figures positioned to amplify her status. Just the dark blue uniform, the pulled back hair, and those 2 eyes moving across the semicircle of 47 species representatives, with an expression that remained stubbornly, precisely, incomprehensibly calm. The neural translators processed her first words without delay. Honored Council, I am Commander Sarah Chen of the United Earth Space Command. I am here to discuss the consequences you have implemented. Drath moved first. He always moved first. His crest flared to full amber, and his voice came out sharp enough to cut. There is nothing to discuss. You will withdraw from restricted space immediately or you will proceed to Stage 5, Chen said. The chamber went still, not the polite stillness of an audience waiting for a speaker to finish. The other kind, the kind that happens when something has been said that cannot be unsaid, when a door has been opened that everyone in the room suddenly realizes they didn't know existed. Chen continued as if she hadn't just interrupted the most powerful diplomat in the Zenthar Empire mid-sentence. Declaration of hostile intent, followed by Stage 6 limited military action, and finally Stage 7 total war protocol. She paused for exactly long enough to let the list settle into the room. We're familiar with the progression. We've studied it extensively. Velshara felt the shift in the chamber's atmosphere the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm. She had presided over this space for 40 years. She had watched species argue, plead, negotiate, and occasionally collapse entirely under the weight of council authority. She had never watched a species sit inside a military containment of 1,100 warships and calmly recite the council's own escalation protocol back at them from memory. You think you understand council protocol, she said carefully. Not think, High Arbiter. Chen made a small gesture with her right hand. The space around her came a lembetism. Data streams materialized in three-dimensional cascades spiraling outward from her position in complex interlocking formations. Mathematical notations, probability matrices, economic models cross-referenced against historical records, cross-referenced against fleet positioning data, cross-referenced against political pressure, analyses that covered, as far as Velshara could tell, in the first 3 seconds, every significant council decision made in the last 200 cycles. We have analyzed 4,000 cycles of council enforcement actions, Chen said, 273 applications of consequence protocol in their complete form. Success rate 100%. She looked directly at Velshara. We understand the pattern. The council uses fear of consequences to maintain order. It is elegant, systematic, predictable. She let the word predictable sit in the room for a moment. But there is a fundamental assumption embedded in your protocol, an assumption that as of approximately 36 hours ago failed. Velshara asked the question she already partly knew the answer to. And what assumption is that? You assume that species respond to consequences emotionally, Chen said. That fear is the deterrent. That when a civilization sees overwhelming force arrayed against it, the emotional response, terror, desperation, the instinct to survive overrides everything else and produces compliance. She looked across the chamber. Humans don't fear consequences. High Arbiter, we calculate them. The data streams around her coalesced. What had been a storm of individual figures reorganized itself into a single massive structure, a model so comprehensive that several delegates instinctively leaned back from it as if proximity to that much organized information might be dangerous. Velshara recognized it immediately with the part of her mind that processed threat assessments. It was a complete map of the galactic political landscape. Every species, every alliance, every economic dependency, every military capability, every historical grievance and unresolved territorial claim and quiet resentment that had been simmering beneath 47 years of enforced diplomatic courtesy. All of it rendered in mathematical precision, interconnected and weighted and annotated, with a depth of analysis that would have taken the Council's own research division years to produce. The humans had produced it from the outside, in less than 3 years. This is Scenario Matrix 7, Chen said. 847 possible conflict paths between humanity and the Council calculated from the moment we entered Sector 447 Theta. Each scenario accounts for fleet movements, economic variables, political pressures, technological capabilities, and approximately 4,000 other factors. Drath laughed. The sound was harsh, and it echoed in the chamber, with underneath the harshness the quality of someone who is laughing because the alternative is considerably worse. You think you can predict what we don't predict, counselor, we calculate. Chen pulled a subsection of the matrix to the foreground. Numbers reorganized, color-coded pathways branched and intersected. In 831 of these scenarios, she said, the Council loses completely. Your fleets are destroyed, your economies collapse, or your political structure fractures under internal pressure. The timelines vary. Some take 2 cycles, others take 20. But in 831 out of 847 scenarios, the mathematical outcome is the same. Drath surged to his feet. We have 1,100 warships surrounding you. We control 47. You have 47 species with competing interests, Chen said. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. We have mapped every political fault line in this council. The Zenthar expansion ambitions that directly conflict with Mulvaran territorial claims in the Outer Rim. The Krathic economic dependence on resources that Councillor Drath's empire wants to monopolize. The 17 minor species who have been marginalized in council decision-making for 6 consecutive cycles and are measuring the distance between their current status and their threshold for alternative arrangements. She pulled up a new model. Velshara watched it materialize and felt something she could only describe as vertigo. Not physical, cognitive. The sensation of looking at a reflection and seeing something you didn't know was there. The model showed the council's internal dynamics, not as the council saw them, not as the carefully managed consensus that decades of diplomatic practice had constructed, but as they actually were. The real pressure points, the real fault lines, the real calculations that each species government was running behind the public positions they presented in this chamber. It was like watching someone peel back a surface to show the structure underneath. Scenario 214, Chen continued. We provoke a conflict that forces the council to commit its full military capacity. The conflict lasts 14 months, you win technically, but the economic cost of full military deployment fractures your supply agreements and the Mulverin withdraw from 3 critical resource sharing treaties. 4 other species follow within 1 cycle. Within 2 cycles, the council loses quorum. She paused. You win the war, you lose the institution. A new model replaced it. Scenario 445, we surrender immediately. We accept all terms. We spend the next 10 cycles quietly building economic dependencies across council infrastructure. None of them large enough individually to trigger review, all of them collectively amounting to 17% of your critical supply chains. Then we renegotiate from a position you cannot refuse. Another. Scenario 733, we fight, we lose. Humanity is set back 200 cycles. But in the process of defeating us, you are forced to reveal your complete military capabilities to your own member species. The Zenthar see exactly how powerful the Krathic have become. Old rivalries that have been managed through careful information opacity are now fully visible. The peace you have maintained by keeping your members slightly uncertain about each other's real strength begins to crack along lines that were always there. Model after model, scenario after scenario. Each one rendered with the same clinical precision. Each one following the mathematical logic to its conclusion without flinching from what the conclusion meant. The chamber was not silent anymore. It was breathing. 47 species processing the same information and arriving at slightly different speeds at the same uncomfortable destination. In 16 scenarios, Chen said, the council achieves what could be termed a genuine victory. Humanity is defeated, contained, or made irrelevant, and the council continues functioning. She let that register. But in each of those 16 scenarios, you spend more resources than you gain. You create political tensions that require generations to manage. You establish precedents that reduce your authority with developing species who are watching this situation very carefully. She looked directly at Velshara. In none of those 16 scenarios does the council actually benefit from conflict with humanity. The best outcome available to you still costs more than it yields. The numbers hung between them. Mariseth's voice was barely above a whisper. No species thinks this way. No one reduces war and peace to equations. No, Chen agreed, and for the first time something shifted in her expression. Not warmth exactly, but recognition. Most species calculate instinctively, then let emotion override the output. We calculate deliberately, and then we look at what the numbers say. She gestured, and the final display materialized. This one was different. Clean. The current situation rendered in pure mathematics. 100 warships, 1 human vessel, economic sanctions in place, political observers watching from the sector boundary, every variable labeled and weighted and connected to its downstream consequences. And beneath it, updating in real-time numbers cascading as the council's own responses fed back into the model. Right now, at this moment, Chen said, I can tell you exactly what happens next. She pulled up the Stage 5 probability tree. If you proceed to Stage 5, you declare hostile intent. Your fleet powers weapons. We transmit the complete scenario matrix to every independent observer currently monitoring this sector. Its percentage values appeared alongside each branch. 67% probability that your own member species begin internal debates about the strategic wisdom of open conflict with an analytical unknown. 43% probability that at least one species formally demands negotiation before weapons are fired. 92% probability that your military expenditure triples within the first month. She advanced to Stage 6. Limited military action. 34% probability. We respond in ways your current models do not anticipate. 78% probability that other species interpret your limited strike as precedent for their own unresolved territorial grievances. 5% probability of galactic scale conflict within 2 cycles. Velshara's voice was very quiet. And stage 7. The display changed one final time. The numbers were worse, considerably worse. Total war with humanity gives you a 96% probability of military victory on a 200-cycle timeline, Chen said, at a cost that will bankrupt 40% of your member species. With political instability that our models estimate has a 41% chance of ending the Council as a functional governing body within 300 cycles. The chamber had gone beyond silence. It had reached the condition that exists on the other side of silence, the place where the absence of sound becomes its own kind of presence. Drath said, his voice stripped of everything except the basic function of forming words. These calculations are impossible. No species could. We brought our work. Chen gestured. Every council member's personal neural interface chimed simultaneously. Velshara felt hers, a pulse in her implants, the sensation of a very large file arriving. She opened it, and the contents began scrolling. 18,000 pages. Every calculation, every assumption labeled and sourced, every variable with its derivation explained. Every model showing not just its output, but its entire methodology laid open for inspection, for challenge, for independent verification. Not because the humans were confident it was right, because they were confident enough to let the council check. You wanted us to fear consequences, Chen said. But fear is an emotion high arbiter. Emotions can be overcome by courage, by desperation, or by simple irrationality. Something in her expression shifted by a degree that was almost imperceptible and somehow completely clear. Mathematics, however, is absolute. Velshara said nothing. The chamber said nothing. And the data scrolled. It took the council 6 hours to find 3 errors. Mariseth presented them during the emergency recess, her melodic voice carrying something that was not quite fear and not quite awe, but existed in the territory between them. Her species-independent analysts had worked without pause since the holographic conference ended, running the human calculations through their own modeling systems, looking for the places where the math broke down. They found 3. All 3 errors were in our favor, Mariseth said. She said it carefully, as if the words required handling. In each case, the humans underestimated their own advantages. They calculated our military response times as faster than they actually are. They modeled our economic resilience as stronger than our internal assessments indicate. They estimated our political cohesion as more stable than the actual state of our alliance agreements. She paused. They weren't giving us nightmare scenarios. They were being conservative. The council chamber absorbed this. Velshara had spent the recess reviewing the 18,000 pages with the dedicated focus of someone who has been presented with something that will define the rest of their career. She had not slept. She had not eaten. She had moved through section after section of the human document with 6 eyes and 40 years of analytical experience and the growing, unavoidable recognition that the math was sound, not approximately sound, not directionally sound with some errors at the margins. Sound. My military analysts reached the same conclusion, said Counselor Theixa, his mandibles moving in the rapid pattern that meant extreme agitation. In the scenarios where the Council achieved tactical victory, the humans calculated our casualties as 15% lower than our own tactical computers project. They consistently gave us the benefit of the doubt. Drath's crest had faded to the dull gray of certainty being dismantled and the replacement not yet arrived. It could still be manipulation, a sophisticated deception designed to what end, Mariseth said. If they wanted to intimidate us, they would have shown worst-case scenarios. They showed realistic ones. If they wanted to deceive us, they would have hidden their methodology. They gave us 18,000 pages of it and invited us to find the errors. She looked at Drath with the patience of a species that had arrived at a conclusion before everyone else in the room. They're not trying to conquer us. They're trying to make us think. Velshara set down the section she had been reviewing. The transmission, the scenario matrix, the EXA confirmed it was broadcast on an open frequency. Low power but detectable. The EXA confirmed. 17 independent observerships at the sector boundary. The Neutral Trading Consortium has 3 vessels currently reviewing the human data. The Independent Worlds Alliance has dispatched a diplomatic courier. He paused. 12 council member species have already forwarded the human materials to their home governments for independent analysis. What had begun as a routine enforcement action had become in the space of 36 hours a galactic event. The scenario matrix was spreading through the political ecosystem of the known galaxy with the velocity of information that is both verifiable and deeply inconvenient to the existing order. We have to negotiate, Mariseth said, not because we are weak, because the mathematics are clear. Escalation costs more than it yields. It has always cost more than it yielded. The humans simply calculated it before we did. Drath's crest stirred. The gray was beginning to shift towards something more uncertain. If we negotiate now, every species in the galaxy sees us yield to a single unarmed research vessel. The precedent. Every species in the galaxy, Mariseth said, is currently reading 18,000 pages of mathematical proof that our protocol has a structural weakness. The precedent is already set. The only question now is whether we respond to it with wisdom or with pride. Velshara closed the document she had been holding. 40 years. 40 years of presiding over this chamber. She thought about what Chen had said in the holographic conference, about systems built on unquestioned assumptions, about vulnerabilities that only become visible from outside. She thought about the 3 errors her analysts had found, all in the Council's favor. She thought about a species that had spent 3 years building mathematical models instead of warships and had chosen to walk into the most dangerous moment of their civilization's history, carrying a spreadsheet instead of a weapon. Reconvene, she said. I want every military analyst and every economic advisor and every political strategist we have standing by with their independent verification of the human calculations. She stood. We have 1 hour. Aboard the human vessel, Morrison was watching probability numbers update in real time and doing the particular kind of breathing that humans do when they are trying not to let their internal state affect their professional presentation. Council's in emergency session, he reported. Encrypted communication volume up 400% across member species channels. The Neutral Trading Consortium just requested a formal copy of the scenario matrix through official channels. They want it on record, Park said without looking up, so they can cite it in future negotiations with the Council. Current probability of Council proceeding to Stage 5, Morrison said. 17%, Chen confirmed. She was standing at the main display watching the probability updates scroll. It held. Stage 6, 4%. Stage 7, statistically negligible, below rounding error. She allowed herself a small adjustment of expression. They're smart enough to do the math once it's been clearly presented. That was always the most important variable. A new alert chimed. Morrison checked it, then looked up with the expression of someone releasing tension that had been building for 2 days. Commander, incoming transmission from the Council. They're requesting negotiation talks. Direct channel. High Arbiter Velshara wishes to speak with you privately. Chen nodded, unsurprised. Patch her through. She moved toward the briefing room. And start preparing Scenario 651, the negotiated settlement framework. Morrison called after her. You already calculated this outcome. 83% confidence. Chen confirmed and the hatch closed behind her. Velshara's hologram appeared in the briefing room looking for the first time since this had begun, like someone who had been working very hard for a very long time. Commander Chen, she said, your calculations. My analysts have spent 6 hours reviewing them. A pause. They are disturbingly accurate. I appreciate the verification. This changes things. Velshara moved to the heart of it without diplomatic circumnavigation. They were past that. You must understand that the Council has maintained galactic peace for 4,000 cycles through this system, through predictable consequences, through fear. If other species realize these consequences can be calculated, can be prepared for, can be modeled in advance. Her voice carried something beneath the professional cadence, the weight of something that had been load-bearing for a very long time. You've undermined the foundation of galactic order. We've exposed a weakness in your foundation, Chen said. There is a difference. Your system worked because no one questioned it. Any system built on unquestioned assumptions is eventually vulnerable to a species patient enough to ask the questions that go unasked. We simply asked them first, and we did it in a way designed to minimize the damage of the asking. You speak of peace, yet you force this confrontation. We forced this conversation. High Arbiter humanity has observed the Council for 23 cycles. We've watched the consequence protocol function. We've modeled the long-term sustainability of your governance structure. She pulled up a model she had not shown the full Council a longer view stretched across centuries. Your system is perfectly designed for external threats and primitive species, but you are increasingly dealing with civilizations that have the time and capacity to study you, to learn your patterns, to calculate optimal responses. The model showed fracture lines emerging over centuries, slowly at first, then accelerating. Eventually, someone would do what we did. We chose to do it first and to do it in a way that gave you the data rather than simply exploiting the weakness. Chen let the model speak for a moment. We are not your enemy, High Arbiter. We are your warning. The distinction matters. Velshara was quiet for a long time. What do you want? She asked finally. Negotiation. Real negotiation? Not capitulation on our side and not capitulation on yours. A framework where humanity participates as a partner, not a subject. A table where decisions are made, not just announced. And a system where consequences are calculated rather than simply threatened. You want us to change the way we have governed for 4,000 cycles. I want you to evolve before entropy forces you to. High Arbiter, we can spend the next 6 months proving that our mathematics was correct. It would be expensive for both sides, devastating in places, and the outcome would be exactly what the models predict. She paused. Or we can spend the next 6 months designing a better system together. One that incorporates what you do best, 4,000 cycles of institutional memory, cultural synthesis, diplomatic precedent with what we do best. Which is, looking at the system from outside and telling you what we see. Velshara looked at her for a long moment. And then something happened that Chen's models had assigned a 12% probability. The High Arbiter of the Galactic Council laughed, not the harsh sound of Drath's contempt, not the musical quality of Mulveran diplomacy, something more private. The laugh of a person who has been presented with a situation so far outside their prepared responses that the only authentic reaction available is the one they weren't expecting to have. You calculated this conversation, Velshara said. The entire exchange, this room, this moment. Down to 74% confidence on your response patterns, Chen admitted, though your laugh was outside my model. Good. The 6 eyes brightened fractionally. It's reassuring to know we can still surprise you. I hope you always do, Chen said, and something in her voice made the words land as more than a diplomatic courtesy. Predictability is useful for mathematics. It is terrible for partnership. Velshara was quiet for a moment that felt lighter than the ones that had preceded it. Very well, Commander Chen. I will bring your proposal to the full council. No promises, but I will present it fairly. That's all we ask. Chen paused before the hologram faded. High Arbiter, one more thing. Yes. Thank you for doing the math instead of the war. That scenario was survivable. I'm glad we do not have to run it. The hologram faded. Chen sat alone in the briefing room for a moment, surrounded by the quiet hum of a vessel that had spent 2 days at the center of the galaxy's most comprehensive military containment and had not moved an inch from where it chose to be. Outside, 1,100 warships held position. Inside, the calculations were already running for what came next. The Council voted 6 hours later. 30 species in favor, 17 opposed, 4 abstentions. Morrison received the transmission and let out a breath that had been waiting 2 days to leave his body. Commander, formal invitation for diplomatic negotiations. Provisional status upgrade. They want you to address the full council. He looked up. All 30 member species who voted in favor have countersigned. It's unanimous on the negotiation side. Chen stood at the viewport looking at the warships. They were beginning to reconfigure. Not quickly. Institutions of 4,000 years did not move quickly, but they were moving. How are they framing it publicly? She asked. Morrison checked the secondary channels. The official council release describes it as a proactive governance evolution in response to new analytical frameworks. He paused. Drath's office has issued a separate statement calling it a strategic recalibration in light of compelling evidence. Good. Chen turned from the viewport. Both framings preserve dignity. Both allow their member species to read the outcome as wisdom rather than weakness. She moved back to the main display. The cooperation scenarios were already loading, 2,317 paths each one waiting to be built. That's what the next 100 cycles depend on, not who was right, who was smart enough to use being right correctly. Park looked at her steadily. You calculated the framing too. Everything after this point is perception management, Chen said. The mathematics of goodwill are as precise as the mathematics of conflict. More sensitive to error, actually. Harder to recover from a mistake. She straightened her uniform. Start preparing the full council address. I want the cooperation scenarios ready. All 2,317 of them. She walked toward the briefing room. And Commander Park. Yeah, ma'am. Make sure the supplementary materials include the known limitations of our own methodology at the 40-cycle mark. She said it without turning around. They need to see that we're not selling them a perfect system. We're offering them an honest one. The hatch closed. Park and Morrison looked at each other across the small bridge of a 47-meter research vessel that had spent 3 days at the center of the most significant diplomatic confrontation in 4 centuries. She already calculated that they'd ask, Morrison said. She calculated everything, Park said. They went back to work. There are 2 kinds of silence in a room full of powerful beings. The first kind is the silence before a decision. It has weight, direction, momentum. Every being in the room is moving towards something, and the silence is simply the space between where they are and where they have decided to go. The second kind is rarer. It is the silence after a truth has been spoken so clearly, so completely, so without possibility of misinterpretation, that the room requires a moment to reorganize itself around what it now contains. The council chamber held the second kind. It had been holding it for 6 hours. Velshara stood at the central podium and looked out at 47 species, and understood with the particular clarity that comes to people in the moments that define their careers, that what happened in the next hour would be recorded in every historical archive in the known galaxy. Her analysts had reviewed the calculations. Her military advisors had run the scenarios. Her political strategists had mapped the downstream consequences of every available response. All of them, independently working from different frameworks with different priorities, had arrived at the same destination. The humans had done the math correctly. She had spent 40 years building and maintaining and defending a system of governance that had produced the longest sustained peace in galactic history. She was proud of that system in the way that only someone who has devoted their life to something can be proud of it. Not the shallow pride of personal achievement. The deeper, more complicated pride of someone who genuinely believes that what they built matters to people who will never know their name. That system had a weakness. The humans had found it, mapped it, quantified it, and then instead of exploiting it, had handed her the map. She thought about what Chen had said, about systems built on unquestioned assumptions, about vulnerabilities that only become visible from outside. She thought about the 3 errors her analysts had found, all in the Council's favor. She thought about a species that had spent 3 years building mathematical models instead of warships, and had chosen to walk into the most dangerous moment of their civilization's history, carrying a spreadsheet instead of a weapon. The humans have presented us with a choice, she began. Her voice carried into the neural translators of 47 species. It arrived with the weight of a decision that could not be unmade. We can proceed with enforcement protocols. The mathematics are clear about what that costs. We have all reviewed them. We have all verified them independently. She paused. Or we can negotiate a new framework, one where humanity participates not as a monitored primitive species, but as an equal partner in the governance of the galaxy we share. Drath's voice came from the left arc of the semicircle. His crest was still the uncertain gray it had been since his analysts confirmed the calculations. High Arbiter, they have 1 ship, 1 vessel against our thousands. How does 1 ship constitute equality? Equality, Velshara said, is not measured in ships, counselor. She pulled up the scenario matrix one final time. The 847 conflict paths, the 16 scenarios where the Council achieved technical victory and lost something more important. The mathematical architecture of a confrontation that nobody in this room actually wanted. It is measured in capability, and the humans have demonstrated a capability we did not know existed. The ability to look at 47 competing civilizations, 4,000 years of institutional behavior, and the full spectrum of possible conflicts between us, and reduce it all to mathematics that we cannot refute. She let that settle. They did not bring warships. They brought something more dangerous than warships. They brought clarity. Miraseth rose. Her voice had regained its characteristic melodic quality, though it carried underneath it the resonance of a being who has been genuinely shaken and is choosing to speak from that place rather than around it. My species completed our independent analysis 6 hours ago. We found 3 errors in the human calculations. She waited a moment. All 3 were in our favor. In every case, the humans were more conservative about their own advantages than the evidence warranted. She looked around the chamber. They were not trying to frighten us into submission. They were not building a case designed to make us feel hopeless. They gave us the most honest assessment of this situation that any party in a confrontation has ever given any opposing party in this chamber's entire history. She paused. I believe that deserves a response that matches the honesty. The vote took 47 minutes. 17 species voted to continue enforcement protocols. They were not wrong to do so, Velshara thought. They were operating from a framework that had served them for generations, and frameworks do not yield without resistance. And resistance is not the same as error. She respected what she would spend considerable time in the months ahead working to bring them into a new consensus rather than simply outvoting them. But 30 species voted to negotiate. 4 abstained. The consequence, protocol was rescinded. For the first time in 4,000 cycles, the Council had looked at its own system and decided that understanding was more durable than fear. Velshara authorized the transmission personally. She wrote the message herself, which was unusual. Protocol called for the Council's communications division to draft formal diplomatic correspondence. But this moment felt like it required something more direct. The message was 3 sentences. The Council extends formal invitation for diplomatic negotiations. Provisional status upgrade to associate member pending treaty ratification. Commander Chen is invited to address the full Council at her earliest convenience. She sent it, and then she waited to see what mathematics looked like when it transformed into something you could actually live inside. Commander Chen stood before the full Galactic Council 2 weeks later. Not as a hologram, not as a transmission, not as an image projected from an unarmed research vessel sitting at the center of 1,100 warships. In person. She had walked through the crystalline corridors of the chamber under an escort that was by protocol and honor guard, and by the quality of attention it paid to her something that existed between escort and curiosity. Beings from 37 species had found reasons to be in those corridors at the time of her arrival. Most of them simply watched her walk past with the focused attention of beings who had spent 2 weeks reading 18,000 pages of mathematical proof and wanted to see what the person who wrote it looked like in motion. She looked most of them concluded remarkably ordinary, which was several of them would later reflect probably the point. The chamber was full in a way it was rarely full. 47 species, hundreds of delegates. Via neural broadcast, an audience extending across the galaxy to billions of observers who had been following the situation in Sector 447 Theta since the scenario matrix went out on an open frequency and spread through the political ecosystem like a very well-sourced piece of news. They had all read the mathematics of conflict. They were here to hear the mathematics of something else. Chen stood at the podium that Velshara had occupied for 40 years and looked out at the assembled representatives of the most powerful governing body in the known galaxy, and she took a breath and she spoke. Honored Council, 2 weeks ago my vessel violated your territorial boundaries. She let that fact sit unadorned for a moment. No qualification, no diplomatic softening. We knew the consequences. We had calculated them. And we proceeded anyway because we needed you to see us. Truly see us. Not as primitives to be observed or subjects to be managed, but as a species that had been watching this galaxy carefully for 23 cycles and had something to say about what it saw. She gestured. A new display materialized above her, not scenarios of war, not probability matrices of destruction, not the 847 paths that led to various configurations of loss. Something different. Something that had taken longer to build than the conflict models, required more variables, demanded more creativity, and had produced, when the calculations finally resolved, numbers that Chen had looked at alone in her quarters one night 6 months ago and had sat with for a long time. We have calculated 847 conflict paths between humanity and the Council. You have seen them. You have verified them. You know what they cost. She let the display breathe for a moment. We have also calculated 2,317 cooperation paths. The numbers materialized, not as warnings, not as threats, as possibilities, each one branching outward into futures that compounded on themselves, returns growing across cycles, the particular mathematics of systems where the components strengthen each other rather than compete. Trade agreements between human analytical capabilities and Council resource networks that increase economic efficiency by a calculated 17% across all member species within 10 cycles. Technology exchange frameworks that advance both human and Council scientific development faster than either achieves independently. Security partnerships that address the 14 active threat vectors your current defensive doctrine has not fully accounted for. She pulled up a specific pathway. Let it expand. Scientific collaboration on the 3 fundamental physics questions that your research division has been working on for 60 cycles without resolution. Our modeling suggests that the combination of Council institutional knowledge and human analytical methodology produces a solution probability of 81% within 20 cycles. Another pathway. Cultural synthesis programs that preserve the knowledge of the 7 minor Council species whose historical records are currently at risk of degradation. Our archival models indicate that without intervention, three of these civilizations will lose more than 40% of their pre-space age cultural documentation within the next 100 cycles. Another. Governance consultation services. The application of predictive modeling to council decision-making processes, reducing the average time to consensus on major policy questions from the current 11.3 cycles to a projected 4.7 cycles while increasing the long-term stability of those decisions. The display filled with possibilities, each one backed by the same rigorous methodology that had produced the conflict scenarios. Each one showing its work, sourcing its assumptions, inviting verification. The mathematics of conflict are simple, Chen said. Someone wins, someone loses. Resources are destroyed, lives end. The calculation is brutal but straightforward. She looked across the chamber. The mathematics of cooperation are complex. Variables multiply. Outcomes branch in unexpected directions. Innovations emerge from combinations that neither party could have produced alone. The calculations take longer. They require more effort. They demand more trust. Her voice carried into the silence of 47 species and billions of distant observers. But the returns are exponentially higher. Velshara watched from the High Arbiter's position. She had been watching Chen since she entered the chamber, and she had been thinking about something Chen had said in their private conversation, about the difference between a peace built on fear of consequences and a peace built on understanding of consequences, about which one was stronger. She had spent 40 years maintaining the first kind. She was beginning to understand what the second kind might look like. Around her, the council delegates leaned forward. The same mathematical precision that had alarmed them 2 weeks ago was now being applied to something that felt, when rendered in numbers, you could verify like the actual shape of a possible future. Humanity asked for partnership, Chen said. Not dominance, not submission, partnership. We will contribute what we calculate best. Analytical frameworks, predictive modeling, long-term strategic planning. We will learn from what you do best. Cultural synthesis, diplomatic precedent, institutional memory spanning millennia. She paused. Together we can build something the galaxy has never seen. A cooperative framework based not on fear of consequences, but on understanding of possibilities. Not on what we can threaten each other with, but on what we can create together. She made a final gesture. A single number appeared above the chamber, clean and alone. 94.7%. That is the calculated success rate of a council that includes humanity as a full partner, measured across a 500-cycle timeline. Compare it to the 62% success rate of your current model across the same period. Chen's expression was neutral, professional. The expression of someone who has done the work and is presenting the results and understands that the results must be allowed to speak before the person does. The choice as always is yours, but the mathematics are clear. 3 heartbeats of silence. Then Velshara rose. The council votes now, all in favor of humanity's admission as a full member species. The count took 4 minutes. 38 in favor, 5 opposed, 4 abstentions. Humanity became the 48th member of the Galactic Council. Not through conquest, not through threat, not through the accumulated weight of military force or economic leverage, or any of the 1,000 other mechanisms through which species had always negotiated their place in a galaxy that distributed power in rough proportion to the willingness to use it. Through mathematics. Through 18,000 pages of honest calculation, 3 years of patient preparation, and 1 unarmed research vessel that had refused to move. 6 months later, the quarterly reports were good. Morrison delivered them in the small briefing room of the Council's diplomatic station, standing at a display considerably larger than the one they had used aboard the research vessel, in a room considerably more permanent, representing a status that would have been difficult to explain to the version of himself that had sat at his console 2 weeks into the confrontation, wondering if they were all going to die. Trade agreements performing above projections, he said. Council species are requesting our economic modeling services at a rate 30% higher than the initial forecast. The Mulvaran want us to calculate their expansion scenarios. The Zenthar are asking for military optimization analysis. Park leaned back in his chair with the comfortable posture of someone who has stopped waiting for catastrophe. Even Drath's Empire has requested consultation on their industrial planning. He submitted the request himself, Morrison confirmed, in writing, with a courtesy notation. Chen looked up from the section she was reviewing. He used the word courtesy. The translator rendered it as professional appreciation. The Ixa said it was the closest Zenthar diplomatic language gets. Chen returned to her section. Everything proceeding within expected parameters. The council was adapting. She had modeled the adaptation timeline at 3 years for meaningful integration, 7 years for the kind of deep structural change that would make the new framework self-sustaining. They were 6 months in and running ahead of projection in several key areas. The governance consultation program had already reduced consensus time on 2 major policy questions. The scientific collaboration protocols had produced their first joint research output, a 17-page analysis of a physics problem that had been open for 60 cycles. The galaxy was learning to calculate instead of threaten. It was learning slowly with the resistance that all large systems show when being asked to change something fundamental about themselves. But it was learning. Morrison set down his report. He had a look Chen had come to recognize over 3 years of working in close quarters on a mission that most of humanity's government had considered either visionary or catastrophically reckless depending on the day. The look of someone who has been carrying a question for a long time and has decided this is the moment to ask it. Can I ask you something, Commander? Of course. When we entered Sector 447 Theta, you said 83% confidence that negotiations would succeed. He chose his words carefully. What about the other 17%? What if the Council had been too proud to recalculate? What if Drath's faction had held? What if they'd escalated past Stage 5? The briefing room was quiet. Outside the viewport, ships from 30 different species moved in the coordinated patterns that had become in 6 months almost ordinary. Council vessels and human ships working alongside each other, guided by frameworks that accounted for the needs and capabilities of everyone involved. Almost ordinary. Not quite. She reached into her personal storage. Not the mission files, not the scenario matrices or the economic models or any of the documents that had been transmitted, verified, debated, and ultimately accepted by the most powerful governing body in the known galaxy. A file that had never been transmitted, never been shown to the Council, never been referenced in any official communication. Contingency Omega. She opened it on the briefing room display. It was not a long document. The scenario it described was the one where everything went wrong, where the Council's pride outweighed its intelligence, where Stage 5 escalated to 6 and 6 to 7, and the mathematics that Chen had been trying to prevent became the mathematics that governed what happened next. Casualty projections, economic devastation across 17 systems, technological regression timelines, the particular kind of numbers that look different from other numbers because you understand, looking at them, that each digit represents a person who does not exist yet, in the future being described, but would have existed in a different one. I carried this calculation every day we waited for the Council's response, Chen said. Her voice was even in the way that a surface is even when something very large is being kept very still underneath it. Every human who might die in the scenarios where we failed. Every family, every child who would grow up in a civilization set back 2 centuries because we forced a confrontation we knew had a 17% chance of going catastrophically wrong. Park was very still. Morrison had stopped taking notes. You proceeded anyway, Park said. The alternative was worse. Chen looked at the numbers on the display with the expression of someone who has made peace with a decision and has not forgotten what the making of peace cost. If we didn't force the conversation, the Council's system would have failed. Not might have failed, would have. The mathematics on that were clear. Within 200 cycles, the structural weaknesses we identified would have been found by a species less inclined to share the map. Or the internal fractures would have widened under their own weight. Millions would have died in the chaos. Multiple civilizations might have collapsed. We calculated that too. She closed the file. The display went dark. Sometimes the ethical choice isn't the safe choice. It's the choice that minimizes total suffering across all probable futures. You calculate every path available to you. You look at what each one costs. And then you choose the one that produces the best possible outcome for the most possible people, knowing that some of those paths cost things you are personally going to have to carry. Park said quietly, that's a heavy thing to carry. Yes. She said it without elaboration, without the diplomatic softening that the conversation might have allowed. Some things are exactly as heavy as they are, and adding words to them doesn't help. Morrison had been listening with the focused attention of someone assembling pieces of something he had been trying to understand for a long time. He looked at Chen, and then at the dark display where Contingency Omega had been, and then back at Chen, and something in his expression moved into a territory that was quieter and more certain than the question he had asked. "It's love too," he said. Chen turned. Morrison continued carefully, like someone walking out onto ice they believe will hold. "It's love too, isn't it? You calculated all those deaths, all those scenarios, all those numbers. You built 3 years of models and carried contingency Omega every day and sat in that chair surrounded by 1,100 warships having curry for dinner." He paused. "Because you love humanity enough to be willing to lose some of us to save the rest. Because you love the idea of what this galaxy could be, enough to risk the version of it where everything goes wrong." He looked at her directly. The council thought they were dealing with a mathematical machine, someone who had removed emotion from the equation. But you didn't remove it. You just refused to let it make your decisions for you. The math was precise because the love was precise. Another pause. "That's not cold, Commander. That's the most human thing I've ever seen anyone do." The briefing room was very quiet. Outside, ships from 30 species moved in their coordinated patterns. The galaxy going about the business of a galaxy that has recently revised one of its fundamental operating assumptions and is still deciding how it feels about that. Chen looked at her lieutenant for a long moment. She had calculated across 3 years of preparation a very large number of variables. She had accounted for fleet movements and economic dependencies and political fault lines and the precise response times of council bureaucratic processes. She had modeled 47 species across thousands of possible scenarios and had been right within acceptable margins about almost all of it. She had not modeled this particular moment in this particular room, with this particular observation landing in the exact place where the mathematics stopped and something else began. She smiled. It was a rare expression. The people who had worked with her for 3 years had seen it perhaps a dozen times, and each time it had the quality of something that was not performed for the benefit of the room, but emerged from somewhere genuine, and was for that reason more affecting than a more practiced version would have been. "Lieutenant Morrison," she said, "you just described the most human thing about us." She stood and moved to the viewport. The ships outside moved in their patterns. "We feel everything: fear, love, anger, hope, grief. The full catalog of what it means to exist in a body in a universe that is largely indifferent to whether you survive it. We feel it all as deeply as any species in this galaxy, possibly more because we are very new to the stars, and the stars are still strange to us, and strangeness intensifies feeling." A pause. "We just don't let it make our decisions for us." She turned back to the room. The council spent 4,000 cycles building a system that worked by making other species afraid. And it did work, remarkably well. But it worked by treating fear as the most reliable force in any political calculation. And fear is powerful, but fear burns out. Fear can be overcome by courage or desperation or habituation. She looked at Morrison and then at Park. Mathematics doesn't burn out. Mathematics doesn't get tired. Mathematics doesn't change based on how brave someone is feeling on a particular Tuesday. She moved back to the table and gathered the quarterly reports. "But Morrison is right," she said, and the acknowledgement landed in the room with a weight that was more personal, more unguarded than everything that had preceded it. The mathematics work because the love is real. You do not spend 3 years calculating the deaths of your own people unless you have a reason that goes deeper than strategy. You do not carry contingency Omega every day unless what you're carrying it for matters to you in a way that cannot be fully rendered in numbers. She set the reports down. "Start the briefing preparation. The Zenthar delegation arrives in 3 hours. Morrison was already at his console. "Yes, ma'am." "And Morrison?" He looked up. "Good question." He nodded. Turned back to his console. The quiet efficiency of someone whose question had been answered and who understood that the answer was one of the things worth working for. Velshara found Chen in one of the station's smaller observation rooms an hour before the Zenthar delegation was due to arrive. This was unusual. The High Arbiter of the Galactic Council did not typically seek out diplomatic representatives in informal settings. Protocol provided for meetings, consultations, formal exchanges. Protocol did not provide for standing side by side at a viewport watching ships move in something that resembled more than any official exchange. Two people who have been through something together and understand each other in the way that only experience produces. "The Zenthar Economic Advisor," Velshara said. "Drath's appointment. He is skeptical." "I know, I've read his reports. He has submitted a formal objection to the consultation program to the Council's Policy Review Committee." "I know that too." Chen watched a council vessel execute a course correction guided by a navigation framework updated with human probability modeling 3 weeks ago. His objection is well constructed. His concern is legitimate. If the council becomes too dependent on human analytical methodology, there is a genuine risk of methodology monoculture. A system that analyzes every question the same way eventually stops being able to see certain kinds of answers. Velshara turned to look at her. You're aware of the flaw in your own methodology. We modeled it. It appears in the long-range projections as a risk factor that needs active management after the 40-cycle mark. Chen met the High Arbiter's gaze directly. I intend to tell him that in the briefing. He'll find it in the supplementary materials regardless. Better he hears it from us directly. Velshara was quiet for a moment. She had been doing this more often since the confrontation, choosing quiet where she once would have chosen words. I have been thinking, she said finally, about what you told me in our private conversation, about systems built on unquestioned assumptions. Yes, I have been thinking about my own assumptions, the certainty that the protocol would function as it always had, the certainty that fear was the most reliable foundation for order. A pause. I was not wrong that fear is reliable. I was wrong that reliable was sufficient. Utual Chen said nothing, which was the right response. The council worked, Velshara continued, 4,000 cycles. The evidence is not ambiguous. We maintained peace across 47 civilizations with competing interests and long memories and the full capacity for violence. We did that with fear, yes, but we also did it with patience and institutional knowledge and a genuine commitment to a galaxy where fewer people die than would otherwise. She looked at the ships. I do not want to lose that in the revision. You won't, Chen said. The 4,000 cycles are in the model. They're a variable with enormous weight. The institutional memory, the diplomatic precedent, the relationships built across generations of careful work. We didn't calculate any of that as a liability. She paused. We calculated it as the most valuable thing the Council has. Velshara considered this. More valuable than the warships. Considerably. Warships can be built in decades. The knowledge of how 47 species negotiate in bad faith and good faith and every complicated state in between accumulated over 4,000 years by people who cared about getting it right. Chen shook her head. You can't model that from scratch. You can only inherit it. The High Arbiter was quiet for a long time. You are going to be a considerable complication, she said finally. I intend to be, Chen said. Complication, in my experience, is what you call the variable that improves the answer. Something moved through Velshara's expression that had the quality of the laugh from their private conversation. Not the laugh itself, the territory around it. One more thing, Velshara said. The Council has voted to formally acknowledge the scenario matrix, not as a diplomatic document, as a historical record. She turned. It will be archived alongside the founding documents of the Council. The original charter, the first peace treaties, the text that defined what the Council was built to be. Chen held that for a moment, the weight of it, something built in 3 years of late nights and probability matrices and the constant low-level uncertainty of a decision that you believe in but cannot fully know until it is over being recognized as something that will outlast the moment it was made. Thank you, she said, simple, honest, requiring no elaboration. Velshara nodded once. The nod of a being who has said what they came to say and trusts the other person to receive it correctly. She left. Chen stood at the viewport for a while longer. The Zenthar delegation transport was visible now, approaching the docking bay, Drath's senior economic advisor. A skeptic with legitimate concerns and a well-constructed objection in a long career that was about to encounter the honest acknowledgement of a methodology's own limits presented clearly before he had the chance to find those limits himself. That was what partnership looked like, not the performance of having no weaknesses. The practice of knowing your weaknesses precisely enough to name them before they became someone else's problem. The age of fear had not ended overnight. It would not end in her lifetime, possibly not in several lifetimes. 4,000 years of institutional habit does not revise itself on the basis of one confrontation, however well calculated. What had ended, perhaps, was the certainty that fear was the only available foundation. The assumption that the galaxy's most reliable governing force was the thing that made you not want to die. That assumption had been replaced by a question. A question that 18,000 pages of mathematics had opened and that no number of subsequent pages would fully close, because it was the kind of question that stayed open and productive and generative, the kind that improved the thinking of everyone who held it. What if we calculated instead? What if we looked at every consequence mapped, every outcome, counted every cost, and then chose not the path that made the other side afraid, but the path that produced the best possible outcome for the most possible people? What if peace was not the absence of the capacity for violence, but the presence of the willingness to do the harder mathematics? Chen turned from the viewport and walked back toward the briefing room, where Morrison and Park were waiting with the industrial optimization framework and the supplementary materials that included clearly documented and fully sourced the known limitations of human analytical methodology at the 40-cycle mark. The council had spent 4,000 cycles maintaining peace through the fear of what they would do to you. Humanity intended to spend the next 4,000 cycles helping build the mathematics of what everyone could do together. It was slower work, more complex, less satisfying in the immediate, overwhelming force way that fear was satisfying. But it worked the way that compounding worked. Slowly at first, almost invisibly, and then with an acceleration that made the early slowness seem like a different era entirely. She had modeled it. She trusted the model. But more than the model, she trusted what Morrison had named in the briefing room. The thing underneath the model that made the model worth building in the first place. The math was precise because the love was precise. That was not cold. That was not the removal of feeling from the equation. That was love made disciplined enough to be useful, rigorous enough to protect the people it was for, honest enough to carry the weight of what it would cost if it was wrong. The briefing room door was ahead. The work was continuing. The galaxy outside did not care about any of this in the way that galaxies don't care about anything, which is completely and without malice. And she found this, as she always had, more honest than comforting, and she preferred honest. The council believed humans would fear consequences. They were wrong. Humans calculated consequences, mapped them, weighted them, held them with the full weight of everyone who would live inside the futures they described. And then they chose. That was not courage. It was not bravado. It was love made precise enough to matter. She opened the door and went back to work.